Murray, I'm gonna use these tiny little mini Glencairn glasses because I always drink too much on these webinars. So I think getting myself a smaller glass is probably not going to help, but we'll see.
Yeah, I have a huge Dapple from Castle and Key, so I should have got a baby Glencairn.
Yeah, I've got my little ones we bought at the Castle and Key when we were there. These are awesome.
What are you sipping on tonight?
I am going to knock into our multiverse bottles. Last time I was on a webinar, we hadn't launched them, and now we have. So this is a kind of sneaky way of telling people to buy some.
Very cool. I love those things. I tried both of them this week, and they're phenomenal.
I'm almost out. Jesus.
We'll have to send you to Green River.
Yeah. Great. I think we'll give it like 5 minutes till we get proper started.
Okay.
And give people a chance to join in. This is awesome, though. I think this is like the most people we've ever had registered for a webinar. So you're famous, Murray.
I don't know about that, but I'm definitely passionate, and this is very exciting. It's been a while since I've talked to a group of people about bourbon, and it's what I love doing. So this should be a fun night.
Yeah, should be awesome. Yeah, I think I'm probably gonna learn a lot of stuff. Your bourbon encyclopedia, so it's gonna be good.
Thank you. I'm interested to hear your insights about Scotch and Japanese imports when we get to that. I think that'll be kind of a novel topic for me. So it's cool to hear about that stuff.
Yeah. I wish when I was living in Japan, I wish I knew what I know now, because I was working in craft beer when I was in Japan for Brewdog, and I remember there was these crazy bottles at like 7-Elevens and stuff. There'd be like I think I remember there was a 20-year-old Yoichi, the distillery that shut down from Nika, just sat there in a 7-Eleven. There was all this crazy bourbon. It was nuts, and I just wish I knew back then what I know now.
I know I follow a few bars in Hokkaido on social media, and they post the craziest vintage bottles, like Stitzelweller from the 1970s, and it's still full somehow. So it's cool to see that market and how different it is to Kentucky, where I'm at.
Yeah, no, there's some really cool bourbon bars. We'll get you over there one day once you've sold like 300 barrels.
That'll be my bonus. Is a trip to Japan.
Sure, to Japan. I'd go with you. I miss Japan. Yeah, a few more minutes, I think, before we get proper started. You ever been to Japan?
Not yet. No, I've never been to an Asian country, but I'd love to go to Southeast Asia or Japan or somewhere in that region. Did you, when you first moved there, was that the first time you had been there?
Yeah. I remember I arrived I had an English teacher's job in Hiroshima, and I just remember landing and just being freaked the hell out. Like, it was just so, just totally like different place. It's like culturally and everything. I was teaching my classes there. I'm not good as a teacher. I don't have any patience, so I think I quit after like 3 months and moved to Tokyo. But it was a good experience. A bit too chill for my vibe, but Hiroshima was a cool place.
That's fascinating. That's amazing that you just picked up and went. I'd love to do something like that. Do you think you'll ever go back?
Not to live. I love going to visit. It's amazing to visit, but the culture is a bit too. You're always an outsider. You always feel like an outsider. I didn't enjoy that feeling. But it gets easier to do it, though. I mean, I came to Mexico for the first time, and I'd never been before. After you do it, I think a few times, it's easier. I love going back. I was back in October. Food, the yen's super cheap now, so it was awesome. Yeah, I'd like to do more things. We have a few clients in Japan, but I would like to be more connected to the place, so I can go back more often. Is definitely one of my.
I have these documents, not from Colonel Taylor, but a little bit later that we can talk about at another time. But there was some connection between Frankfort, Kentucky, and Osaka back in the 1940s, and a lot of documents in the local historical society. So we'll have to look into that because there was some like heavy overlap even back then.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, that's interesting. There's a lot with Scotland as well, but yeah, Kentucky as well. Right. I mean, I think we can get started. People can pop in as they come. Do you want to maybe share the presentation? I'm going to pour my whiskey. We can get going. Almost at a bottle fill here.
Alrighty.
Awesome. Let's get going. So, I think this is, we're here today with Murray and George. I guess want to go to the first slide there.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I don't really like self-introducing myself, and I do this every time, but hi, I'm George. A little wave. Now, I'm the founder of Barrel Global, own a few other brands as well. But yeah, I founded Barrel Global basically a few years ago now. I was doing a lot in Scotch, a lot of Scotch cask trading in Asia. So a really good opportunity here in the US to kind of introduce this kind of business model of barrel ownership here in the US. There's a lot of amazing distilleries in the country, and it's went really, really well. I've really enjoyed it. I love the bourbon people. They're super open, super excited. You know, that's something I love about the bourbon industry that we'll probably go into, and Mario will touch on that. You know, they're just excited. Everybody's just, I guess prohibition slowed them down. So now that that's gone, everybody's just super excited about doing new things, getting into new markets, innovating, trying new things. And that's what I love about the industry, the fact that we can work with all these different producers across different states. And I really love what Barrel Global has turned into. So thank you to all you guys, to the team, everybody that's on here. Yes, very exciting. Thanks. But let's talk about someone more interesting. Murray, do you want to go to your slide?
Yeah,
so,
thank you.
We recently hired Murray. He is based in Kentucky, and he's a descendant of E.H. Taylor. It's his great-great-great-great-grandfather. Like, it's like sixth generation, direct descendant of E.H. Taylor, which is amazing. As many of you know from the bourbon, who know about bourbon, he's one of the most iconic people in the history of bourbon. And, there's obviously a very famous brand named after him, and he's just a very, very well-known figure. And Murray looks after all of our customer experiences, bottlings that we do for clients. And if you ever buy barrels and you go on a tour, you go to Kentucky, you want to go to different distilleries, Murray's the guy that's going to go with you. Murray previously worked at Castle and Key, and the kind of the tours and customer experience sector of the company. And yeah, the guy knows. I mean, I've never met anybody that knows as much about bourbon as Murray knows, and you will all see that very soon. He's very deeply passionate about the bourbon industry, very, very much so. Great asset to the team. You've only been with us for like a few months, but it's been great having you, and I'm very excited about this. As we'll get to hear some awesome historical facts you probably have never heard of, some inside knowledge from a direct descendant of E.H. Taylor. And yeah, it's going to be a very exciting webinar.
Thank you, George. Just to jump in real quick, because this story doesn't come up a lot. I've been in the bourbon industry since 2018. I joined Castle and Key Distillery when I was freshly 21. And there's some important context with this all, because right now, E.H. Taylor is a super big name in the industry. Bourbon's hot, and everyone knows who he is, and everyone knows what bourbon is. But back in the early 2000s, when I was growing up, bourbon wasn't nearly as popular as it is now. And we'll talk more about this on the next few slides. But my family's former distillery, the old Taylor distillery that is now Castle and Key, was in total ruins. And it was actually owned by a salvage company that was tearing it down. And I watched that as a child. We'd drive by, but maybe or maybe not hop the fence and check the property out. And to see that was quite sad. So when I saw Will Arvin purchase Castle and Key in 2014, it caught my attention real quick. And I began following the project. And then I ended up moving back to Kentucky in 2016 to go to Transylvania University. And shortly thereafter, I reached out to Castle and Key because I was so amazed at this unique property that's like probably the coolest historical artifact in Kentucky. And I asked if I could come walk around, and they were more than happy to host me for a little tour. And it actually, it turned into a job interview, and they offered me an internship that day, and it totally changed my life. Over the next few years, I saw Castle and Key rise from the ruins, and it instilled a sense of pride and passion in me that you only get once in a lifetime if you're lucky. And we'll talk more about how all that happened and what I think is cool about the industry, but I just wanted to throw that out there because it paints some context for how I got involved and what gets me excited as a member of the Taylor family and a descendant of VH Taylor, but also as a very passionate whiskey enthusiast and drinker. So I appreciate the introduction, George. I'm really excited to talk about some of these old stories and how they connect to what's going on in the industry today.
Awesome. All right. Well, next slide, we have just a little agenda. So we're going to talk a little bit about, obviously, the history of bourbon, how it's evolved over the years to become what it is today, how it's expanded globally. It's became, obviously a global commodity now, something everybody loves, how it went from the past to now. We're going to talk about authenticity, a lot about visitor experiences, what authenticity means, what these distilleries have went through and what they've done to kind of revive, restart, and innovate and, come into the 21st century. We're going to talk a little bit about some economic downfalls and things that happened to bourbon in the past and how these, corrections in the market and economic downfalls helped the industry become what it is today and help the brands that did survive grow a lot. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the future of the market, about what the future of bourbon tourism is, and finally end with the Q&A session that I'm very happy and thank you for everybody who's sent in some questions. One thing I want to touch on now, please do stay till the end because we have a bottle giveaway from one of our distillery partners. It's a mystery bottle, so I'm not going to say too much, but we're going to choose somebody, one of the attendees at the end of this webinar. So that's me forcing you to stay till the end. Bribing you with a bottle of bourbon. Anyway, so let's get started. I guess you touched a little bit about your connection to H. Taylor and how that's kind of influenced you and your time at Castle and Key, to influence your bourbon appreciation. Would you say that your history and your lineage is what influenced your bourbon appreciation? Or because again, you are very, 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 very passionate about bourbon. Or do you think it's your time at Castle and Key? What do you think's, because you're obviously very young, and it's good to see young people getting into whiskey, and it's not just like an old man's thing. But what do you think influenced you and really instilled this bourbon appreciation in you?
Yeah, I would say it's a combination of those two things you just mentioned. I kind of caught the industry at the perfect time. I entered in 2018 when bourbon was really gaining national and global popularity. So there was a lot of excitement. And I realized after a year or two that I was in the golden era of the bourbon industry. And it was really cool to see that happen. In addition to that, it's hard not to fall in love with bourbon if you're working at a castle or a place like Castle and Key Distillery every day. Everyone that came out there was super passionate to be there. And it's really a great group of people that are very prideful about what they make and passionate about what they do. And I think seeing that inspired me. The family lineage definitely played a big role in it because it gave me a role model that I hadn't had as a child. And it just was a combination of these factors that came together at the right time in a perfect way that really kicked off a passion that I'll have for the rest of my life. I love doing this, and it's what I'll be doing till I retire.
We hope so, Murray. We hope so. We hope you keep doing this with us. And would you, I guess getting a little bit more into your background, do you have any a cool story maybe, or something that I guess no one will really know and it's not in the books and stuff like that about, your family's history in bourbon?
Yeah, I've got a few. I think a good one to kind of start out with would be just to go over the evolution of what happened to my family's brand after Prohibition and kind of insert a cool story into that. So my family, initially, Colonel Taylor's grandfather was distilling on the property where Castle and Key and the old Taylor distillery were. There was family connections to the land where Buffalo Trace and Old Fire Copper were as well. And there was this really rich lineage of distillation in those areas. So from the early 1800s up until Prohibition, Colonel Taylor and his grandparents were making the best whiskey available in that region. And then, sadly, as we all know, Prohibition started in the 1920s. That caused some serious obstacles for Colonel Taylor and his children who were running the brand. They managed to partner up with a large corporation that was consolidating barrels and bonded warehouses that I'm sure some of the viewers have heard of. It's called the National Distillers Products Corporation. So they began buying up all these brands like Old Taylor, Old Crow, Old Overholt, and Old Grandad, and consolidated several hundred of them, making the Old Taylor Distillery their international headquarters and the head for global operations. Then in 1936, my family sold them the property and the rights to the brand, and National owned it up until the 1980s. As we all know, the market took a slight downturn in the late 70s and the 1980s. It was known as the bourbon glut. And National Distillers ended up moving into the chemical sector as Quantum Chemical, and they moved out of spirits production entirely. So they worked out a deal to sell several of their properties to the Jim Beam Corporation. Jim Beam looked at the numbers, and when they bought the castle, it didn't make sense to keep it going. It had a huge overhead, and having a brick and mortar that large has a lot of expenses that come with it. So they didn't have a huge interest in maintaining that brand, and they kind of they put it on a back shelf, so to speak. And then through some legal disputes that ended up happening between Jim Beam and Sazerac, which is a story for another day, they ended up trading several labels. And the result of that was Sazerac and Buffalo Trace ended up with the Old Taylor label and rebranded it as E.H. Taylor. And this was in the early 2000s, around 2009. When they did, they had this real desire to launch it in an authentic way. And they wanted to honor the traditions and the legacy of people that came before them. So they actually reached out to my family and asked if we had any old mash bills, and we did. So my great uncle, E.H. Taylor Hay, lent them a 1917 bottle of Old Taylor bottled and bond. And their master distiller and team of chemists pulled about 20 milliliters out and had it analyzed to get an idea of its composition. And they learned some stuff that Colonel Taylor did that is very different from what happens today, or even back in the last century. So he actually didn't add yeast to his mash. He did something called a spontaneous fermentation. If you like Belgian beers like Lambics and Creeks, that's exactly what they do there. And George, I'm sure you've had these. You get a lot of funky flavors from those wild yeasts. Mm-hmm. Colonel Taylor had honed that in, and the resulting funk was this pronounced butterscotch taste that's so heavy, it's like a paint roller dipped in butterscotch going over your tongue. And that created a fascination for spontaneous fermentations and these more obscure production methods. And I think that's something that's lost in the industry today. There's only a couple distilleries doing anything like that. Neely family, one of our partners, actually does a wild fermentation. But for the most part, every distillery is making bourbon the exact same way with cloned yeast and the same methods. So I thought it was really cool to learn that there were other ways that made better products that were kind of lost to time. And that's what sparked this fascination for history and gave me this curiosity to read bourbon primary sources and really study it from a historical perspective. And that's kind of led me to where I am today, working at Barrel Global and also working on this biography of E.H. Taylor with a couple writers.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird turn of events, but it was a cool one to find out.
Yeah, I guess a lot of like old practices got lost, just I guess in terms of like efficiency and just being able to control the whole process throughout and keep consistency, I suppose. But it is nice to see when some distilleries are trying new things and trying to hold on to some old traditions. I mean, you see it in Scotch, you see it tequila, bourbon. It's always fun to see. What would you say are some like 2 to 3 like the most pivotal moments in bourbon's history that kind of helped it shift from like just a small craft to making it this global phenomenon that it is today? What would you say some like key moments are?
Yeah, so to paint the picture, back in the late 1700s and early 1800s, bourbon wasn't a thing like it is today. Most people drank rye whiskey made in Pennsylvania or Maryland back then. Another popular spirit was British rum, and brandy was also pretty pretty commonly found around there. Bourbon didn't emerge till much later, and anything that would have been similar to bourbon back then looked like this. It was clear, and it wasn't made to the same standards we have today. So over the 1800s, you see this evolution, and the way it started is in Kentucky County, Virginia. These farmers would have a lot of leftover corn. They were given land grants based on the amount of corn they could grow, and it would go bad because they had no refrigeration back then. So they would distill it to preserve that surplus, and then it would give it a commodity value, and it would never expire. It was non-perishable. So it was worth way more than the grain they started out with. And you have the story of Elijah Craig in the 1830s and a few different figures that people claim to be the first person to distill bourbon. I've spoken to just about every formal bourbon historian, and the real answer is we have no idea when bourbon started or who the first person was. In reality, it was probably a bunch of those people doing this simultaneously, and a few of them became well known for it. But I'd say the most important part that took bourbon from this agrarian method of production into an industrial craft happened in the late 1800s. You had the evolution of rectifiers, which were making blended whiskey in the late 1800s. And they were competing against the distillers. And those were people like E.H. Taylor and some of those farmers I just mentioned. And bourbon was getting messy. There were no laws defining what it was and wasn't. And consumers were getting hurt. I'm sure you've heard of rot gut whiskey. People were going blind and they had no idea what they were drinking. So I'd say the most pivotal moment was the Bottled and Bond Act of 1897. E.H. Taylor was actually the architect for that. And it mandated these quality control laws that created an element of consumer protection and transparency. And that's created the industry that still exists with us today. Fast forward about half a century, you have bourbon being made America's native spirit in 1964. That's obviously a very pivotal moment when, by law, bourbon can only be made in the United States of America. And it really becomes the official spirit that it's known as today. And then I'd say in the late 80s and early 90s, the resurgence of all these small independent distilleries was extremely important. Like we just mentioned, before Prohibition, there were thousands of brands across the US. Many farmers even had their own still. And then during Prohibition, you had a handful of companies gobble up every single one of them. And only those companies existed after Prohibition. But recently, in the last 25 to 40 years, you've had this reemergence of these independent brands operating on their own. There's over 2,000 DSPs or distilled spirits permits in the US. And you're kind of getting this shift back to how it was in a way, more of a hybrid because there's modern production methods. But I'd say that those three moments paint a really good picture of the evolution of bourbon and how we got to where we are today.
Yeah. I guess it's like a movement towards obviously higher quality, craft, different practices. I guess that's like a common trend as we've been moving ahead. That's it. I think, you know, for me, I think the next moment that's coming is also all these small producers, obviously producing in different states across the US. And I do think the international market's still a very big, I mean, that'll be a big step when bourbon becomes like more of a thing internationally. That's definitely, in my opinion, something that needs to happen, and it's happening slowly but surely.
Definitely. And bourbon hasn't reached all of its consumers. The Kentucky Distillers Association has done a lot of economic analysis. And if you look at the consumer base for bourbon, it's not maxed out, whereas some industries have reached every consumer they're going to reach. And the only way they can grow is by inflating their prices. Bourbon's quite the opposite. It has a lot of growing to do globally and even in this country. And I think the biggest drivers of that growth are going to be expansions into tourism and more unique types of tourism that distilleries are going to start putting out, which we'll get to in a second, as well as the movement for premiumization and ultra premium products. I think those two things are going to become very important in the coming years.
Yeah, definitely. And I suppose like honing more into like your past with Castle and Key and the visitor experience, what would you say authenticity is in like the context of bourbon, and how would you translate that into like the customer experiences that you would provide people and the visitor experiences that you would provide?
Yeah, so I think authenticity is really important. It's extremely important for a distillery to be proud of their work. And I think it speaks volumes to that pride if they invite people in and show them how they're making their products. That whole concept is relatively new. It actually began with E.H. Taylor back when he founded the Old Taylor Distillery in 1887. And if you look at the images on the slideshow, it gives you an idea of how amazing this distillery was. Back then, your average distillery was a sheet metal warehouse or a shack. And then E.H. Taylor came along and built a place like this. And it's really like Willy Wonka and Walt Disney had a friend that likes bourbon. If you look at these photos, it's over the top and it's amazing. And he believed that a good bourbon should have a good distillery. And I think that his example he set by having a Roman bathhouse over his spring, a castle for the distillery, and English pleasure gardens for the guests to walk around, set a really important precedent and also created the element of bourbon tourism. It came from the German beer gardens. And before E.H. Taylor started the Old Taylor Distillery, people weren't going on distillery tours and they weren't invited into these essentially factories. But after that, you see Maker's Mark start giving tours in the 1960s and 70s. And slowly but surely, you have this huge tourism industry growing out around these distilleries, where today, just about every distillery that has a brick and mortar gives tours of some kind. And some are different, some are a little more in-depth than others, but I think that's a super important aspect of this. It allows you to connect with people, share your story, and it also allows the consumer to gauge from their perspective your products and your processes.
Yeah. I think it shows how amazing he was when, I suppose nowadays, a lot of distilleries are like renovating and innovating for the future. Whereas, when Castle and Key was bought, they did everything they could to like revive like what E.H. Taylor had done. I think that shows how ahead of his time he was with everything he was doing. That's what they tried to do. And I think, and the amount of time that was put into bringing back what he created, obviously with some new innovation is just really goes to show the influence he had if he did that so far back, and it's still exactly what people want today.
Definitely. And for those that don't know, this is what the Old Taylor Distillery looked like in the 19-teens prior to Prohibition. And in just a second, you'll get to see what it looked like when I was a little kid. It's totally different. And it's amazing because if you go there today, it looks exactly like it does in these photos. And Will Arvin, the founder and owner of Castle and Key, didn't initially plan to fix the entire property up. He thought that the buildings were in such bad shape, it'd be best to just have it as a museum of ruins. And he might take the best building and thought he could do a small operation that made a couple barrels a month and had a gift shop. But after learning about Colonel Taylor's legacy and the magnitude of all this history, he felt an obligation to bring the entire place back to life. And slowly but surely, the capital expansion budget kept growing and growing to something that kind of looks like a phone number. And the reason for that is because when I was a kid, this is what Castle and Key looked like. It was the former Old Taylor Distillery, and even my family thought it would be impossible to bring back to life. I think that really speaks to the perseverance of the bourbon industry and how a little bit of passion can make a miracle happen. Because a 116-acre property that looks like this doesn't seem possible to bring back to its former state. But I think he exceeded that. I think in some ways it's better looking today than it was then. And what's amazing is he did it with everyone around him thinking it was impossible. But that's all it takes, is just one person with some passion.
Yeah. I mean, I'll speak to that. I mean, we visited last month and I've been to a lot of distilleries, but it truly is probably like the most wow factor and amazing distillery I've been to in the US. Truly amazing place. If any of you guys get a chance to go, highly recommend it. It's not really something you can explain with words, sadly. Like the images that you see here and then reviving it back to how it was with the gardens. We got it in the snow. it was fantastic. We have a video for you guys later to see, but it is something you need to experience on your own, in my opinion. So I guess we've talked a little bit about, you know, your history and like the bourbon history, E.H. Taylor, the Castle and Key Distillery and its renovation. I suppose looking more to like the current, I guess the historical corrections, and I suppose looking at the economic side of things. How do you think like the historical corrections in bourbon kind of help us navigate the market today? Like the strategy that you use, what happened back then, how it kind of brings us to today, and how can we learn from what happened and how it was dealt with?
Yeah, there's a few examples over the last 180 years that I think really serve to answer that question. When E.H. Taylor left Old Fire Copper in the 1870s, he left completely broke and bankrupt. There was the Great Panic of 1873, and the market was in a full recession. Not just the bourbon industry, but the entire U.S. economy was in a recession. And within 15 years, he had the castle built. And I think it's amazing that everything you just saw in those photos was built after he was 70 years old and had been completely broke and bankrupt. And I think that goes to show that these corrections are moments of opportunity, right? You really don't want to buy a house in 2007, but if you bought one in 2009, you probably made a lot of money. And I think it's just the same with this industry. And E.H. Taylor faced that periodically throughout his career. In 1911, there was another market correction. Shortly thereafter, he made more money in 1 year than he made in his entire career preceding that, but by a lot. And I think that's another example of how these are moments of opportunity. Then, if you look at the 1980s correction that came after the bourbon glut of the 70s, a lot of today's best success stories began back then. Brands like A.H. Hirsch started in the bourbon glut of the 70s, and now it's known as the best bourbon you'll never taste or something like that. So I think for the passionate, those moments are the moments to get in, and they have a huge opportunity. And you can just look at history to see how that worked out in the past. And for people like E.H. Taylor, it worked out very well.
And would you say like these kind of economic downturns, these difficulties led, I mean, I personally think so. Nowadays that happens, but do you think back then that led to, you know, more innovation, you know, resurgence, like people just doing things differently? Do you think that's something that happened back then with bourbon?
Absolutely. So throughout those historical corrections, you saw different attempts at innovation. In the 1800s, E.H. Taylor attempted to organize all the different distilleries and get them to produce less, because he knew that production surplus levels and consumer demand would heavily determine the commodity price of the barrels. They attempted that, but he couldn't get all the distilleries to organize. And during the next few corrections, you see different attempts. And the ones that really worked were the attempts that involved tourism and the attempts that involved premiumization. The tourism one kind of speaks for itself, being we're looking at the resurgence of Castle and Key, which is one of the highest rated and acclaimed distilleries in the country. And then the premiumization element also comes from these moments of correction. I love Kentucky Bourbon Distillery's vintage bourbons from the 1980s, Stitzel Weller, and brands like that. And the really, really cool stuff all came from that. And I think it creates this opportunity for innovation, because things have to change. They can't continue the way they were. And the industry is very flexible, especially smaller craft distilleries and non-vertically integrated groups. And what I mean by that is brokers and producers that don't have a brick and mortar, that are decentralized and don't have this huge overhead from having a brick and mortar. I think those types gain a tremendous advantage in these. And innovation will have to happen. Things will have to change. Historically, it's worked out, and excited to see what happens in the future. What about you? I know we talked a little bit about this at Castle and Key, but do you think that the innovation that came out of those really got the industry to where it was today, or do you think it was more kind of an organic growth?
I mean, as you said, I always think like I love this story because I do think like someone with some passion can overcome pretty much everything. And you know, we've seen it in Scotch, we've seen it across all different categories, and in bourbon, that these are the kind of times in the past that, you know, when there's everything's growing, everybody's entering the market, tons of people coming in. And then when there is a correction in the market, that's when all this excess kind of seeps away, and the people that are actually innovating, really do believe in the industry, stick around and grow a lot, because as everybody falls away, you know, that's the focus that comes. And that's what we try and do in Barrel Global. That's why we work with producers that are, you know, they can be big, they can be small, but at least they're heavily focused on their brand, the story of their brand, they put a lot of focus in growing their own brand, as opposed to, as we've seen in the last year or two, all these contract distillers coming online. And great. I mean, I hope it all survives. But I think when that kind of volume of similar liquids, similar everything, not building their own brands comes online, you know, there will be a lot of excess liquid. But I think our focus on these kind of innovators, really cool brands, award winners, doing cool things, collaborating with cool brands, reaching, you know, different pockets, right? Like we work with distilleries that work with sports teams or fashion brands, or, you know, it's just that's what I think. I don't think it's organic. I think it takes a lot of passion and a lot of perseverance, in my opinion, and that's why this guy was just a legend. Because, you know, as you said, he was 70 and broke, and he still, you know, made all this happen, and that's why, you know, both tried so hard and has succeeded in kind of reviving and keeping this guy's dream alive after all these many years. That's a legacy, you know, in my opinion.
And since you said that, I do agree that it's not just organic, it takes work. And if you look at the smaller brands, it's much easier for them to do that work. Historically, the brands that fell off during past corrections were the largest producers in the industry, like National Distillers, for example. They owned most of the bourbon brands and had like the most bourbon stock out of any of their competitors. And they fell off pretty quick because it's harder for them to navigate those obstacles. But thankfully, the people we've had the pleasure of working with and the people I admire are able to jump through those hoops. They're able to make new products, to try cask finishes, bold things. And I think it's really cool to see that, because you get a lot of variety. And when the winners emerge, it's a pretty cool process to look back on in hindsight.
No, I totally agree. And honestly, it's tough for small brands these days with the kind of Goliath companies behind, you know, that obviously have a lot more budget to do things. That's why I am happy about the distilleries we work with, and that we might help them, you know, purchasing these barrels from them, some cash flow up front, that helps them, you know, obviously invest that into growing their brand some more. So I feel it's like a win-win-win situation thus far in what we do.
Yeah. Since real quick, since we've told everyone that these brands that made it through the obstacles had to be innovative and persevere and really follow their passion, to give you an idea of what came out of these ruins, you'll see on the next slide, this is what Will Arvin transformed the ruins of the old Taylor Distillery into in a 4-year period. So he purchased it in 2014, and by September of 2018, they opened the doors to the public, and this is exactly what it looked like. And I think that's a great example of what we just talked about. It sounds overly optimistic at first until you see something like this, and then it looks very real.
Yeah, no, it's pretty awesome. I'm going to bottle kill this multiverse bottle. Okay, if everybody was watching, using smaller glasses doesn't really change anything. So, and this is my first dram this week, just everybody who's worried about me. So one thing I wanted to touch on is the barrels that we bought. So there was luckily for everybody who has bought Castle and Key barrels from us, there was a little misunderstanding, and we managed to get a much rarer, not rarer, but it wasn't the time to get the mash bill that we got, but they did it for us because that's kind of what had been discussed, because we got weeded bourbon that it's not the current season for it, and apparently people queue outside the distillery, like it sells out super quick. So we're very happy we managed to get that mash bill. Do you want to touch a little bit on that, Murray, for people that are maybe interested or have bought a barrel already?
Yeah, so when I found out that happened, I was pretty surprised because, like George just said, back in my Castle and Key era, I saw queues of 2,000 people line up in front of the gift shop to come get these releases. So we ended up with some wheated Castle and Key bourbon. Doesn't have that rye grain in it, which makes it a little more peppery. It's got the wheat, which gives it some sweeter tonalities. I notice in the aged version of this, a lot of dark honey, some like cocoa tannins, and then a pretty pronounced stone fruit, like estery bouquet. And it's phenomenal whiskey. George and I tried it during our visit last month, and I think it's the best expression Castle and Key makes. I lean towards wheated bourbons and vintage bourbons usually because I like mellower pours, but I was really glad that we ended up with that. And it's good juice too, and it's got a good story behind it.
Awesome. Yeah, so wink, wink, if you want a barrel. I'd like to kind of touch a little bit as well. I remember when we had your interview, and I remember you were super adamant that you saw the future of bourbon, like a lot of the future of bourbon casks and et cetera, and what we're doing is in customer experience. It's in bourbon tourism. It's in customer experiences to the distilleries, dinners. Do you want to touch a little bit on what you foresee the future and the role of bourbon industry, what the role of bourbon tourism is, for the bourbon industry in the coming years?
Yeah, so I really believe that the obstacles the industry is going to have to navigate in the coming years can be minimized by expanding into tourism. I think that opens the potential to reach more of that demographic that the industry is currently not reaching. I wish it wasn't this way, but if you look at analysis, sadly, there's not a lot of women that are consuming bourbon and visiting distilleries, at least not as many as men. So I think by opening up these properties and creating a more hospitality-centric experience, it's going to help the industry grow in a very organic and powerful way. I think a very good example of where it's headed in a decade or decade and a half can be seen on the West Coast. Napa Valley does the guest experience extremely well. People will go out there for 3 days to a week. They'll have curated dinners and all kinds of planned activities. And I think that's the direction the Kentucky bourbon industry is headed. You're starting to see this. I firmly believe it started with the resurgence of Castle and Key, but over the last few years, you've seen other distilleries pop up that have a huge focus for hospitality. They're all currently under construction, but they're kind of aiming to be bourbon Disneyland. And I think that creating those experiences, keeping people engaged and on the property is going to help the industry so much. And it's also going to get more consumers in and just make it a more diverse, bigger industry, which will be good for everyone involved.
Yeah, 100%. I do agree with that. And I suppose you've done obviously a lot of tours in your days. You've done a lot of research on the bourbon industry. What would be your advice to someone looking to start investing in the bourbon industry?
Yeah, so I feel very strongly that you should follow your passion. I think you should do some research, get exposed to these brands, come visit a distillery and meet me there, and we'll talk about it. And find something you're very passionate about that you believe in. And I think that's the best way to do this. At least that's what I did. Because when you find those products that you're passionate about and you see the pride from the team making them, it makes a difference, and it sets all of that stuff apart. In addition to that, I think it's super cool that you can own a barrel and get in on the ground level and essentially become a stakeholder in this industry. So I think finding distilleries to visit, pick your favorite, and then find a way to get in, be it by buying a barrel or coming out for a tour, is the best way to start that process. And if what happened to me happens to you, passion will kind of take over, and you'll see opportunities that you didn't see before, and you'll find friends that you didn't know you were going to meet, and it kind of gains form in its own way, just because it's such a cool thing to be a part of.
Nice. Definitely going to invest in bourbon now.
Just real quick though, what kind of pointed you towards investing in bourbon originally? Because I know you started out with Scotch and Japanese whiskey. So like, what's your version of that story?
Honestly, I honestly I saw it was at a point when the Scotch industry was becoming too saturated. There was too many like I've never been a bottle collector. I don't buy anything I'm not going to drink. I just didn't want to get into that. That wasn't really me. I get sent a lot. I still write a little bit for Forbes and different. So I get sent bottles. I buy some bottles, but I won't buy anything I'm not going to drink. I prefer to drink it. In terms of Scotch, though, it was at a point where I was still doing Scotch casks, but there was just way too many investment companies coming into it. People that had no passion for bourbon whatsoever, for whiskey whatsoever, knew nothing about it, were just in it to make a quick profit and disappear, had no reputation in the industry. And I had a partner in the US that we worked with a few different companies, and I was consulting a lot at the time, and I just saw a really big opportunity in bourbon, which I'm really happy I banked on, because I just saw that this kind of service didn't really exist. There was a lot of white label stuff being sold and renamed, and the distillery wasn't ever mentioned, but no one was focusing on the distillery stories. Everybody was buying, MGP liquid, contract distilled liquid, putting their brand on it, hiding the fact that it wasn't distilled by them, or kind of like maneuvering around it. But then there was all these cool distilleries popping up in, different states outside of Kentucky, Tennessee, New York, Colorado. And it just seemed to be, it was on the precipice of something big, of terroir coming into bourbon, of different temperatures, different altitudes, different places, different maturations, different ideas. And I saw that opportunity. And as I got more and more into it, I really enjoyed it. And honestly, I love Scotch. I'm half Scottish, so I can say this. So it's not being racist. But I don't know, Scotch, at that point, they were a bit too full of themselves. I think Asia was buying a bunch of Scotch. You try and work with them and they'd be like, you know what, whatever, I don't need you. Whereas bourbon, they were way more receptive. They're way more like, I'm a go-getter. I'm like, you work with me, Murray. I'll email, message. I'm like relentless, and I like to keep going and trying new things. And in bourbon, I found that. I found people being excited. We did our multiverse releases, and we're speaking to our Colorado distillery, and he's sending me like lists of, what about this idea for a comic? What about this idea? What about this liquid? It's easier and it's fun. Whereas Scotch, I remember me being in the industry, I write for Forbes. I was not well known, but I wasn't like that. I entered the industry yesterday, and I'd still get just like, nah, not interested. I don't care. You take a bit of time, they'd reject you. It was just a bit. Now probably their tune's going to change, that Scotch is seeing some difficulties. But that's what attracted me to bourbon, honestly. It was the energy, and it was the innovation. It's just new. It's fresh. Like Prohibition sold things, I'm sure. But I feel there's so much room for like new flavors, new maturations, new ideas. And we can see that happening. And that's why, I'm excited for it to go more global and more markets, for it to grow in more markets. And it's great seeing brands like Michter's, innovating and giving it global recognition, what Castle and Key's doing with tradition and history, what Bardstown's doing with innovation and, technology. It's just great seeing all these producers taking bourbon really global and making it grow.
And you just said something that really spoke to me. You mentioned how you saw a lot of terroir emerging in the bourbon industry. I'm sure most of our clients know that word very well. For the folks that don't, terroir means dirt in French, and it's kind of the flavor of your environment. That's what ignited my passion. I told that story earlier about learning how Colonel Taylor used wild yeast and did the spontaneous fermentation that resulted in these funky flavors. I've been fortunate enough to try. And like we said, that technique fell off the radar, and no one really did that in the last century. And it's only recently reemerged by 3 distilleries. So I think there's a lot of room to bring these techniques back, to get new flavors and to do new things, or I guess old things that aren't being done. And that excites me. I don't know if FOMO is the right word, but kind of moves from hospitality to operations and bottling, and slowly but surely, I'm honing in on being able to do some of those cool things that were lost to time that bring that terroir back into the industry.
Yeah. No, yeah, it's there's just so much to go. And I love the kind of ideas that come from state to state. Like everybody thinks different. And that's the first step. Obviously, all the surrounding like environmental aspects affect maturation, but it's also just people's minds in different. Like someone from New York City is going to do something very different to what someone from Louisville is going to do, and that's what's enjoyable. And I love when our clients come on and they're like, "Bourbon's only made in Kentucky." That's always a fun conversation. They like open their eyes. Right, so that's us at the end of the questions that we have for Murray. We are going to show you a little video of our visit to Castle Key. No one's seen this yet. This literally finished being edited today. So you can have a little look of our visit. We got it in the snow, which was awesome. It was freezing, but it was pretty. And after that, we're going to go into a bunch of client questions, viewer questions. I don't know if you're all clients of ours, but a bunch of the viewers have asked some cool questions that we're going to get into after the video, and then we'll choose who wins the bottle. So, Murray, do you want to fire that up?
Yes, sir. All right.
There's no sound on it. Should there be? There's no sound, is there? Or is it just me not hearing it?
Is it coming through?
I don't hear any sound.
Let's try.
We messed it up.
Can you hear that?
Yeah, there isn't any sound. Let me see. Sorry, guys.
While George is doing that, it was like 6 degrees Fahrenheit during that tour. And if you haven't heard of the Kentucky Hug, we heard of it that day. So as you know, when you drink whiskey, you get that warm, peppery feeling. And we had been walking outside for like an hour and a half, exploring these cool old buildings. And then we ended the tour in this warehouse from the 1800s with 36,000 barrels around us. It's actually the longest whiskey warehouse in the world. It's the length of 2 football fields, and we ended it with a Kentucky Hug, which I highly recommend.
Right. I'm going to try this again. Let's see. Please let me know if there's sound. Wait. And, okay. Hey everybody, George here from Barrel Global, and I'm here with John Newton, who's the head of business development here at Castle and Key.
Good to be here, George.
I'm excited for today, and we've got Murray Harwich, the newest member of our team, who leads all our experiences and bottlings here in Kentucky. So we're about to go on an awesome tour of the Castle and Key distillery. If you've bought a barrel, this will be really useful for you. If you haven't bought a barrel yet, this will also be very useful for you, because that's what you should do.
This water is used in the first phase of production. Later on, we introduce reverse osmosis water just to have the most neutral water possible. But this water is going to be very dense in calcium and magnesium, which is ideal for the fermentation process.
Okay.
Taylor operated here up until 1920 when Prohibition hits. Coming out of Prohibition, Descendant is then acquired by National Distillers, the behemoth that essentially owns over 50% of the aged whiskey in the United States.
Okay.
And they go and they are purchasing as many distilleries as they can, and they're expanding upon those distilleries as well. So they take this site from doing about 150 barrels a day under Taylor to 600 to 1,000 barrels a day at the peak of production. It is one of the largest distilleries in the U.S.
Fermenters in here dating back to 1936. Each of them has an 11,000 gallon capacity. And right now they're cooking bourbon whiskey, and you can tell they're at different stages in the process. When they're bubbling, they're most active, and eventually they'll dry out on top, forming what we call a distiller's cake. When that happens, whiskey's ready to distill. So if y'all follow me, we'll go down and check the still out. And the whiskey's gonna be pumped in and it's gonna fall down to the bottom. You've got heat coming up from the bottom and it's gonna essentially boil off all those volatile compounds. So all of it rises as vapor to the top. The stuff you don't want to end up in the final product is gonna cool off before it makes it to the top, falling back down as liquid. And you can think of it as constantly cycling throughout that process, refining it into pure ethyl alcohol. So his column still would have been in the tower we just exited, and then he had a copper pot still. The reason they use copper is because it's a great conductor of heat, and it also removes the sulfurous compounds from whiskey. When you're fermenting with groundwater, aka limestone spring water, you can end up with some sulfurous compounds, and by creating copper stills, it removes all of those and gives you a much cleaner flavor. Distilleries would mostly sell whiskey by the barrel, and it would go to saloons and jug houses. His marketing idea was if you were at the jug house and you saw a bunch of barrels with dirty, rusty rings next to one with pristine brass bands, there'd be a clear winner. And that's how he would market his brand early on, effectively growing it and becoming one of the most well-known bourbon brands that's ever existed.
This is one of the most modern buildings on site. It was built in 1953 by National Distillers. Capacity is about 65,000 barrels. We are palletized ricking on the first floor, and then we have gone back through and reinstalled traditional ricking on all the floors above us. This is effectively an 8-story building. Poured form concrete is also designed to be a nuclear fallout shelter. When it was built during the Cold War, if you go to the upper floors, you can still see the little signs that say fallout shelter. So this is a little Castle and Key 7-year wheated bourbon.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you.
Yeah, pleasure. There's a lot of you otherwise.
Man, awesome. This has been super cool. Thank you so much. How you've kind of managed to make it a bit modern, but really stay true to tradition, to all the buildings, kind of maintaining everything, but making it, obviously an 21st century operational distillery has been amazing. It's been really cool.
Well, George, we appreciate you guys coming out today, braving the cold down here in Millville, Kentucky. We're excited to make your whiskey and looking forward to the partnership.
Thank you so much, man.
Cheers.
Thank you, John.
Here we go.
Cheers. Shift's over, guys.
That made me want to go back out there.
Yeah, that did not look as cold as it was.
No.
That looked way more like normal temperature than it was. But that was a super cool tour. Awesome. Okay, cool. Well, that was the Castle and Key Distillery, guys. We had an amazing time. Yeah, it was awesome. You see it. It was freezing, but seeing it in the snow is totally something different. But apparently, Murray said if you see it in the spring, there's tons of like the green, lots of birds, different like butterflies flying around and stuff. So I'm assuming it's also very nice and very comfortable in the spring when we go back. You said that's the best time to visit, right, Murray?
Yeah, I'd say April and May are the best time in the spring. You get all the flowers blooming and blossoms. And then conversely, in September, October, and November, it turns into a different world. The last week in October and then the first week in November, everything's like crimson red and orange, and it's unbelievably cool and beautiful out there. And if you buy a barrel, you can come see for yourself, and I'll meet you there.
There we go. Nice. I like that little segue. Right. Well, let's get into client questions. Murray, you don't need to share anymore. I think
Okay.
People can see our handsome faces up closer. That's what everybody wants. Right. We're starting with a cool question by Mark Wilson. this one for you, Murray. I would love to hear. I think you just stop presenting down the bottom there. So if you click on that.
There we go.
Right. So Mark Wilson asks, I would love to hear Murray's thoughts on the impact Colonel E.H. Taylor made beyond his own brands with the whole Kentucky distilling community in the mid to late 1800s and what it means to his family.
Oh my gosh, this is a great question. I'm excited now. So nice job on that one. It's a huge impact, right? So E.H. Taylor owned and operated 8 different brands. Some of them grew into the most influential distilleries this country's known. Brands that evolved into companies like Buffalo Trace, Woodford Reserve, Old Crow, and Castle and Key, which are all independent at this point, but they have that shared lineage going back to Colonel Taylor. Past that, the entire industry has that lineage. If you remember from earlier, Colonel Taylor was the chief architect of the Bottled and Bond Act. That was that regulatory framework that got the industry operating in an effective, transparent, and safe manner. And it still operates under a lot of those principles. Not all products are bottled and bond, but none of them are going to make you go blind if you drink them today. And that's something we owe to the Bottled and Bond Act. And then lastly, the element of bourbon tourism.
You drink enough.
Yeah, if you get baby Glencairns and have a multiverse bottle, that might happen. But conversely, every distillery that offers tours has that same lineage dating back to the old Taylor Distillery and Old Fire Copper, inspired by the German beer gardens, creating visitor experiences for people and just making the industry better and more transparent and authentic. And then I touch on this lastly is that Colonel Taylor was a contemporary of James Crow. He started the Old Crow brand in his honor, and he bought a lot of barrels Crow had made, and he followed the same method, which was called the Crow Plan. It's a distillery layout that produces something called sour mash. I'm sure you all have heard of this. It's a layout every distillery, but those 3 I mentioned earlier are still using, with a few modifications, mainly because science has innovated a lot, equipment's changed, and we know more. But I would be hard-pressed to find a distillery that doesn't have something dating back to Colonel Taylor's legacy or some connection, be it tourism, the production method, or sour mashing, or even just the fact that the products are transparent, they have the producer info on the label, and you know who made it, where, and when.
Awesome. Well, Mark, I hope that answers your question. Moving on, a question by Brian Reed. How has the slight correction in demand affected Castle and Key? How are they reacting to that, and what are their thoughts on short, medium, and long-term market forecasts? I'm not sure we can speak for Castle and Key, but Murray, I'm sure you have some insight on that. I think we chatted a bit on the tour about what their thoughts are, right?
We did, and after we had the tour, I actually had the privilege of having lunch with the founder and owner of Castle and Key, Will Arvin. And I don't want to tell Will's story. That's his story to tell, but he's incredibly optimistic. He thinks this is a time to double down, and that's what he's doing. If you go to Castle and Key now and you go this summer, you're going to see expansion. They're building more warehouses. They're making walking trails. They're making the product more beautiful for tours. And I think if you have liquid cash, this correction's an opportunity to grow. Like I said earlier, these moments of change are moments of opportunity. And I don't want to speak for Castle and Key, but I believe they see it the same way.
Awesome. Right. Tim, sorry, I'm just siphoning through these, but we just time constraints. Tim Wilson, exit strategy after maturation 4 years. With a downturn in the bourbon market, do you see the industry going back to where it was 1 to 2 years ago from a private investor standpoint? Price of aged barrels going back in value in 4 years? I mean, I can take that one. This very much depends on, again, the barrels that you have. Like a 4-year-old barrel of some nameless contract distilled liquid is a very different value to like a 4-year-old cask of Castle and Key that Castle and Key doesn't even sell. So something Castle and Key doesn't offer 4-year-old stock. So for you to find that is quite rare. So for you to have it, that's also rare. So I don't see that happening. We are very careful with the distilleries that we work with. A lot of them don't even sell casks to other, or like to maybe 1 or 2 other people. I know that Law's Whiskey House doesn't sell a lot of barrels. Our partner in New York, our partners in Tennessee. So I don't see that happening. The price growth might slow down slightly until, the correction happens and everything. I don't see it. It's not going to go down. And it's just very much about the liquid that you're buying and the distillery that you're buying from. And I see it continuing to grow. Murray, what do you think?
Yeah, I think what you said is extremely accurate. And there's one important factor people forget about, and it's called angel share. You have to remember the stuff in the barrel is slowly evaporating 5 to 10% a year. And the consumer base is growing. It's slowed down a bit. But with those factors, if you're patient and you're playing the long game, which I think everyone in bourbon knows about and should be playing, that this isn't really much more than a slight obstacle over the next 1 to 2 years. And I think looking back at history, since that's been a big topic today, anytime there's been a major correction or downturn, patience and perseverance got people through it. And as long as you don't own 200,000 barrels and have a brick castle with a huge overhead, you're probably going to be fine.
Yeah. And again, this is a time when you see and I'm very happy with our distillery partners, because those are the ones that double down, find new ways and move ahead. I know that Castle and Key's working with some amazing brands and supplying some very, very big brands. I know that Law's Whiskey House has that Buffalo's collaboration they're doing that's super cool. I know that Kings County in New York are doing some really cool things. And I know that now that we've been in the business for a few years, we really can see all the kind of the strong distillery partners that we have. So more so than age, I'd look at the distilleries that you're buying from, and I would steer clear of these contract distillers. In all honesty, I'll say it, and get behind a brand that they have a full team focused on building the brand, which is why we're selling their barrels. That's always what I say. They don't have a full team selling barrels because they're out there building their bottlings, building their limited editions, building their collaborations. That's what you need to look at. And that's what's going to continue. And that's what's going to come through as all these, contract distillers and massive Goliaths that can't survive go away.
To add some quick insight to that, I joined the bourbon industry in 2018, and I was young at the time, but I always wanted to buy barrels to do something with in the future. They were really hard to get in 2019 and 2020 when the industry was at the point it was at. I always envied the people who got in the late 90s and early 2000s, because that's where the opportunity was. Alan Laws talked about that during the last webinar, and I'll leave the finance to George and Alan, but I think that was well said. Yeah,
definitely. This is the time. So moving on to Vikram Sampij. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. Bet you can't pronounce my name though. But anyway, I always say that when I can't pronounce somebody's name that well. Scotch versus bourbon and how each one evolves over time in terms of the audience. I mean, I can take that one. Scotch had plainly said, a head start. Prohibition didn't happen to bourbon, to Scotch. And Scotch has grown a lot over the years. I mean, I entered the industry, say when I was 25, 26, so 8 years ago. And it was great back then. Macallan casks, I'll speak on the cask industry more. Macallan casks were flying, 300,000 pounds a cask, 500,000 pounds. Sorry, I changed to pounds when we're doing Scotch. But yeah, it was a great time, but it was just people charging way too much for what the product was. China was buying a lot back then that they're not doing now. And that's, again, when tons of pure investment companies came in. Don't get me wrong, we sell casks and we obviously expect you to retrade them and make a profit in the future. But when you have like real estate companies and just pure trading companies coming into Scotch just to make a quick profit, and then honestly, without a reputation in the industry, that means that they can just disappear and no one's going to find them or care. Me, I have a reputation in the industry, Murray does. We obviously can't do that because our reputation is destroyed then. So I'd say the difference between bourbon is that selling casks of bourbon, just like Murray said, a few years ago was weird. It was different. I remember we started Barrel Global and I'd be speaking to distilleries and they'd be like, what? No, I'm not. That's weird. I'm not selling you casks. And I need to really explain to them why we want naming rights and why we want this, this kind of arrangement. So honestly, I think bourbon still has a lot to grow and a lot of ways to go and a lot of recognition to receive from international markets. Because, I mean, we need to understand that 90% of what bourbon does is domestic. In terms of the audience, I don't know what that question means, but the audience is very different. Bourbon collectors and Scotch collectors are very different people, and we've found that from all our marketing efforts and all our sales efforts. But I would say that Scotch is in a difficult position right now. Obviously the liquid's still great, the distilleries are still great, but there's a correction happening there because there are too many investment companies in Scotch cask trading. Whereas in bourbon, I feel that's not happened yet, and I'm happy it hasn't happened. There are a few, but I think just over-promising and just in a lot of cases, just smoke and mirrors and lying to customers just never works. And that's why Barrel Global, we've heavily focused on people with a reputation, building the reputation of our brand, doing it with experiences, doing it with great customer service, always being there for our clients, and being honest with our clients and giving them real expectations that we adhere to is what I love about our company and what I love about the distillery partners. You can call anybody. You can call Castle & Key tomorrow and they'll have nothing but good things to say about us. Or Murray's going to be down there knocking. But yeah, I mean, in terms of audience, it is a different audience, but I think Scotch is having a harder time than bourbon right now. And just because of all these, like the huge amount of Hong Kong, London investment companies that have came in and highly overpriced stuff to people. But if you're buying Scotch and you're buying it at a decent price, it's still a great product. And there's amazing distilleries in Scotch like there are in bourbon. But I hope that answers your question. But if you want me to elaborate more, do reach out and we can do that. Now, Paul Amais from Buffalo, New York has asked a few questions. So I would like any perspective on produced volumes in North America, trend lines versus consumption. The idea to overlay inventory that has increased in the last 5 years, 2025 has reduced production already, assuming a 3 to 5% CAGR on consumption. When is there an inflation point back to inventory reduction? I know not easy. Is what years it is consumed as part of the equation?
I have a pretty good answer for that. Unless you want to jump in real quick, but
I'll take another one. I'll take the second one.
Yeah, so I think there's two parts to this. Historically, if you look at what happened in the 1970s, which is the best example of a bourbon crash and glut, that was caused by fear of another war coming. So during the 1950s, you had the Korean War going on. Distilleries in the coming decades were really scared there was going to be another World War II style ration. So they way overproduced, 200, 300, 400% increases in production volume. And that created the bourbon glut of the 1970s, where supply and demand didn't line up the way they were supposed to. However, if you look at the brands that are around today that started during that period, they're the most successful brands in the industry, hands down. They won the cake at the end. And I think that speaks to just opportunity, timing, and perseverance in all of this. And then if you look at the 3% or 3.4% compounding annual growth rate listed in that question, that's an average based on all the growth in the industry. And there's outliers pulling that mean far from the middle that make it what I consider not a very accurate representation of the people we're working with. We're picking those hand-selected craft distilleries who aren't making contract barrels by the 100,000 volume. And they're more proud of their work, and it's just a different strategy. So I think that statistic represents the industry as a whole, but it doesn't represent these small producers because, like I said, it's that average. So it's all encompassing.
Yeah. So I think, just focusing, I think the growth is going to come in like premium and ultra premium product offerings and limited stuff, which is what we offer. We can't really know the production in the US because there's so many, like, as we discussed, contract distillers coming online. But what we are focusing on and what we offer are our categories that I think will continue to grow. That premium and ultra premium side of the market is what we see the movement, growing in. There's an additional question here: is how will the next 4 years of U.S. political direction adjust the course from last 40 years? Taxes, imports, tariffs. Honestly, I think obviously this is going to be good for bourbon. I don't want to see tariffs come, like higher tariffs come on like Canadian whiskey, Scotch whiskey, tequila, but I don't see the current president messing with bourbon. If that's like a decent way to say it, it's a domestic product, and that seems to be his focus. So I don't see. I think this is going to be good for bourbon, if anything, for sure. In my opinion. Next, Gene. Minimum and cost of per barrel, also brand and how long it ages. What is the profit margin? Where are the distilleries located, and where can we get samples? I urge you, Gene, to get in touch with us, and we will provide you with all the kind of PDFs you need to know on what distilleries we currently, what distillery offerings we have right now, the age of them, the cost of them, and like maybe we can also tell you what a current 4-year-old of that version is today, so you can kind of do the math. So please do get in touch with us at barrelglobal.com. You can request access and for a consultation right on the homepage. Kevin Kaufman from Iowa. What is the repurchase percentage of fresh fill investors? I don't really understand what that means. But, I mean, if you buy a new fill barrel today, it costs around, I'd say $2,000 to $2,500 US. And then today, that same 4-year-old barrel, we also sell them for like $5,000. So that's an average. But again, if you want to have more discussions on pricing and all that, please do get in touch with us, and our sales team will take you through exactly what's happening. Today, we can tell you what a new fill barrel costs. We can tell you what a 4-year-old costs, 3-year-old costs, 5-year-old costs, and you can, figure it out. Todd, Cam, thoughts on the current market conditions, downturn, rebound. As we said, and we've discussed many a time with Murray here on this call, is we think this is a great time to enter the industry. The brands that we work with and the people that we seek out are people that are heavily working on developing their own brands, and this is the time when those kind of people shine through, and the growth comes with that. And we think this will last a year or two, and then all the kind of real passionate brand building, innovative distilleries will not only survive but also grow greatly during this period when a lot of the others kind of die away. Randy Robber from Texas. Where are these stored? How is it distributed? Well, a lot of it, we have a storage partner in Kentucky that we send most of our barrels to, not because we don't want to store at the distilleries, just because it makes it much easier for our customers to visit and actually try their own casks, see their own casks. A lot of distilleries, we can store a lot of them, but because just of the sheer volume and operations of said distilleries, it's hard for our clients to go and actually see their barrels and taste them and touch them, and that's something we do want for all of our clients. So we have a central storage distillery that a lot of our distillery partners in Kentucky actually work with, because they have a lot of warehouses. So if they run out of space, they send a lot of the stuff there. So that's where we have our barrels. If it's in different states, we try to keep them at the distillery, because we do want the liquid that we buy from said distilleries to mature in the way that it was supposed to. So if we buy a barrel Colorado Laws whiskey, we want it to mature in Laws warehouses, because then the maturation will resemble the actual products that Laws puts out, and the stuff that you might have tried. We don't really want to mess with that by sending it to Kentucky to a different climate. Vitesh has asked, storage costs and exit guarantees, what's the future of bourbon? Storage costs, I think you need to get in touch with us for that, because I'm not really sure. Exit strategies, you know, we work, a lot of our clients are bottling clients. So it's a kind of healthy 70-30 split of people that want to hold their barrels and people that want to bottle. And that is growing, and we're heavily investing this year. And that's actually, as the guys are selling away and Murray's looking after the customers and the bottlings, my role alongside a few other partners in different global markets is to expand on exit strategies. So we are working with a lot of bottling clients. We're putting a lot more marketing and funding into searching for bottling clients, working for a lot of brands. I got my kind of need more whiskey. I'm joking, getting more water. We're working with a lot of different bottling clients, a lot of big brand conversations, retailers that want their own single cask picks. We're basically really delving into the exit strategies this year. I own another company called In Barrel that gets you bespoke bottles of tequila to your door. We will bring bourbon into that as well. So it'll be a minimum of a few bottles that you can personalize your own label. So that will also take in a lot of the casks. And I'm heavily focused on international markets. My history in Asia and in Europe is leading to a lot of really good conversations with people that do want to get into bourbon and like our expertise in the market and the access that we have. So the idea is to expand the bottling with bottling clients for Barrel Global, but also taking it internationally to a lot of importers, distributors that want to take bourbon into said markets, into Asia, into Europe, South Africa we're speaking to too. So yeah, this year is a heavy year for us in developing more and more exit strategies for our clients. Multiverse we obviously launched, which is our own brand of comic book and single cask whiskeys that we also are going to expand greatly on, and that will also lead to an exit strategy for our clients. But that is just some of the things that we're working on right now, and also some big corporate company and investment company talks that could take on a large amount of aged barrels. Can definitely delve more into that, but I think we're getting there on time. Right. Last question by John Gandy is of the Admirals Club Lounge. A discussion on the projections coming out that the bourbon market is about to be flooded, as well as a discussion about the possibility of blending our barrels when we are ready to bottle. Do you want to grab that one, Murray? I feel I've been talking for a while.
Yeah, can you read the last part of that one more time for me?
So it's a discussion on the projections coming out that the bourbon market is about to be flooded, as well as a discussion about the possibility of blending our barrels when we're ready to bottle.
Okay, yeah, I thought that's what they meant. So we haven't done too much blending for people ready to bottle, but at Castle & Key, I selected single barrels, and I'm a very talented organoleptic analyst, aka I like to taste whiskey, and I can tell you what it tastes like. So that's something I'd be more than willing to assist you with, though we don't do it formally. And there's a lot of projections that the market's being flooded, but that's an average. What it's being flooded with matters, right? If it's 2- and 3-year-old straight whiskey that is a little young, that's very different than if it's flooded with 20-year-old bourbon. It's not flooded with 20-year-old bourbon. It's flooded with a lot of contract distilled products with young age statements from brands that don't have a lot of transparency and authenticity. So I think kind of taking that into consideration gives a lot of important context. The other thing is people like to drink bourbon, so it's not going to stay around forever, and that'll be corrected. And I just think that taking all that into account is pretty important.
Yeah. Amazing. Right. So that's us at the end of the webinar. As I told you, now you know that Murray is an encyclopedia when it comes to bourbon. I urge all of you or any of you to get in touch. Murray is in charge of all the client bottlings, customer experiences, can answer any of your questions. There's a video coming out of him actually explaining the entire bottling process for anybody that's doing that. And now let's select our bottle winner. All right, so let me see here. I'm trying to do this randomly. Like I need to, what do I do? Do I just, okay, close my eyes. Yeah.
Maybe
right.
pick that one. Yeah.
What? Wow, you distracted me. Wait, I'll do it again. Okay. I'm just scrolling, and the winner is Russ Corey. He has won the mystery bottle. Russ will get in touch with you. And thanks for attending the webinar. But yeah, thank you so much for everybody attending. Murray, thanks a lot, man. This has been awesome. Very, very educational. Great to have you on the team. If you want to say any closing words, and we'll call it a night.
Yeah, thank you, George. It's been a pleasure to kind of meet everyone and get to tell my story and share some history. And to everyone in the webinar, thank you all so much for tuning in and listening tonight. Hopefully we'll get to share some more stories and you'll get a chance to come take a tour with me. And thank you all for tuning in. So cheers.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, guys. And we'll see you all soon. Have a good night.